They were told Americans would tear their babies from their arms and leave them to die. But when 247 Japanese women and children stepped off the transport ship at Manila Bay in September 1945, the enemy broke them not with cruelty but with medicine and milk. They expected their infants to be ignored, perhaps killed. Instead, they watched American medics kneel in the dirt, checking tiny pulses, wiping fevered brows, and handing out bottles of formula. The mothers had prepared themselves for the worst fate imaginable. They got something far more confusing: compassion. If you're interested in untold stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden history. The September heat in Manila was merciless. It pressed down on the crowded deck of the transport ship like a heavy blanket, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The smell of salt water mixed with unwashed bodies, soiled clothing, and the sour scent of sickness. On the deck, 247 Japanese women stood or sat with their children, waiting. Some held infants wrapped in torn cloth. Others had toddlers clinging to their legs, too weak to stand on their own. These were not soldiers. They were civilians. Wives of Japanese military officers, nurses who had served in field hospitals, teachers who had worked in occupied territories, shopkeepers and their families. When the war ended, they found themselves trapped in the Philippines, far from home, suddenly transformed from occupiers to prisoners. Their clothes were ragged, stained with dirt and sweat. Many wore traditional kimonos that had once been beautiful but were now faded and torn. Their hair hung limp and unwashed. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath hollow eyes. But it was the children who looked the worst. Babies lay limply in their mother's arms, their skin hot to the touch, their breathing shallow and rapid. Toddlers whimpered softly, too tired even to cry. Some had swollen bellies from malnutrition, their tiny limbs like twigs. Others had rashes covering their skin or coughed with deep, rattling sounds that made their mothers' faces tighten with fear. Keiko, a 24-year-old mother from Osaka, held her 6-month-old daughter Yuki against her chest. The baby's body was burning with fever, her small face flushed and damp with sweat. Yuki had been sick for 3 days, and Keiko had no medicine, no clean water, nothing to give her except her own milk, which had nearly dried up from lack of food. Keiko's hands trembled as she tried to soothe her daughter, whispering prayers she wasn't sure anyone would hear. Around her, other mothers sat in similar states of desperation. Some rocked back and forth, singing soft lullabies. Others simply stared into space, their faces blank masks hiding terror. They had heard the stories during the war. Americans were brutal, savage, without mercy. Japanese propaganda had filled their heads with images of American soldiers committing atrocities. Now they were at the mercy of these same Americans, and their children were dying. The ship's horn blasted a deep sound that vibrated through the deck. Women jumped, clutching their children closer. Babies wailed. The engines rumbled to silence, and suddenly the constant noise they had lived with for days was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the cry of seagulls and the splash of waves against the hull. Then came the sounds of boots on metal. American soldiers appeared on deck, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, their faces serious but not angry. They carried clipboards and medical bags. One called out in broken Japanese, telling the women to prepare to leave the ship. The smell hit Keiko first as they descended the gangway. The overwhelming scent of the Philippines, mixing tropical flowers with diesel fuel, cooking food, and the muddy shore. But underneath it all was something else, something clean and sharp that she couldn't identify at first. It was disinfectant. The Americans had set up medical tents right there on the dock, their white canvas bright against the gray of the harbor. The women walked slowly down the gangway, helping each other, carrying their children. Keiko's legs shook with each step. She hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. The sun was blinding after days below deck, and she had to squint to see where she was going. Her feet touched solid ground, and for a moment she felt dizzy, the world tilting around her. American voices surrounded them, speaking English in tones that seemed too casual, too relaxed for what was happening. Some soldiers pointed, directing the women toward the tents. Others stood watching, their expressions unreadable. Keiko expected to see hatred in their eyes. She expected anger, disgust, perhaps cruel smiles. Instead, she saw something closer to curiosity, and in some faces, what might have been pity. The women froze when they saw the medical tents. White-coated figures moved inside, and tables were set up with supplies. Red crosses marked the canvas. To Keiko, it looked like a trap. Why would the enemy prepare medical facilities for them? It made no sense. In Japan, they had been taught that Americans valued only their own people, that they saw the Japanese as less than human. A woman next to Keiko whispered, her voice shaking. "This is where they will separate us from our children. This is where it begins." Others murmured agreement, their faces pale beneath the sun. Some women began to cry silently, tears streaming down their cheeks as they held their babies tighter. But an American soldier, a medic with a kind face and gentle hands, approached the group. He spoke slowly in Japanese, his accent thick but understandable. "Please bring the sick children first. We have medicine. We have doctors. Your babies need help." No one moved. The mothers stood like statues, torn between their children's desperate need and their overwhelming fear. Keiko felt Yuki's hot skin against her chest, felt the shallow rise and fall of her daughter's breathing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to protect her child from whatever horror awaited in those tents. But where could she run? They were prisoners, surrounded, helpless. The medic stepped closer, and several women flinched back. He held up his hands, showing them he was unarmed. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He looked directly at Keiko, seeing the sick baby in her arms. His eyes were brown and sad, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. "Your daughter is very sick. Please let us help. I am a father, too. I have a little girl at home. Please." And in that moment, Keiko made a decision that would change everything. With trembling steps, she walked toward the medical tent. Behind her, other mothers slowly followed, their hearts pounding, their minds racing with fear. But their children were dying, and perhaps, just perhaps, this enemy might help them survive. Inside the medical tent, the temperature dropped slightly, offering relief from the scorching sun. 3 American doctors waited, along with several nurses. They wore white coats and had stethoscopes around their necks. Medical supplies covered the tables, bottles of medicine, rolls of clean bandages, syringes, thermometers, and other equipment Keiko didn't recognize. A female nurse, perhaps in her 30s, with red hair tied back in a neat bun, approached Keiko with a gentle smile. She gestured to an examination table. "Please sit. Let me look at your baby." Her Japanese was better than the medic's, and her voice carried no threat, only professional concern. Keiko sat down slowly, still clutching Yuki to her chest. The nurse reached out her hands, and Keiko's body tensed. This was the moment. This was when they would take her baby away. But the nurse didn't grab. Instead, she waited, her hands open, her expression patient. "May I?" With movements that felt like lifting the world, Keiko slowly transferred Yuki into the nurse's arms. The baby whimpered, her eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again. The nurse cradled her carefully, supporting her head, and carried her to the examination table. She laid Yuki down gently on a clean white cloth and began her examination. The nurse's hands moved with practiced skill. She checked Yuki's temperature with a thermometer, listened to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope, examined her skin, her eyes, her mouth. She spoke softly to the baby throughout, her tone soothing, even though Yuki couldn't understand the words. Then she called over one of the doctors. The doctor, an older man with gray hair and glasses, examined Yuki thoroughly. He pressed gently on her abdomen, checked her reflexes, looked in her ears. His face was serious but not unkind. After a minute, he nodded to himself and turned to Keiko. "Your daughter has pneumonia and severe dehydration," he said in careful Japanese. "She needs antibiotics immediately, and we need to get fluids into her. But she will recover. We can help her." Keiko's vision blurred with tears. The words didn't make sense at first. Recover. Help. These were words she had stopped believing in. The nurse was already preparing a syringe, drawing liquid from a small bottle. She swabbed Yuki's tiny arm with alcohol, the sharp smell filling the air, and then gave the injection quickly, efficiently. Yuki cried out, a weak wail that broke Keiko's heart, but the nurse immediately picked her up and soothed her. Next came the IV. The nurse explained what she was doing, showing Keiko the bag of clear fluid that would help rehydrate Yuki. She inserted the small needle into a vein in Yuki's arm with practiced care, securing it with tape. Within seconds, the fluid began dripping into Yuki's body. Around the tent, similar scenes played out. Other mothers watched in stunned silence as American medical personnel examined their sick children with genuine care. A toddler with a severe rash was gently cleaned and treated with ointment. A baby with dysentery was given medicine and electrolyte solution. A 3-year-old with a dangerous cough received a shot and was wrapped in a clean blanket. The Americans worked efficiently but never roughly. They explained what they were doing. They spoke gently to the frightened children. They handed mothers clean cloths to wipe their babies' faces. One doctor even gave a small toy, a rubber duck, to a crying toddler, making the boy stop and stare in wonder at the bright yellow object. Keiko sat beside the examination table, watching the IV drip slowly into her daughter's arm. The nurse brought her a cup of water. "Drink. You need this too." Keiko took it with shaking hands and drank. The water was clean, cool, the best thing she had tasted in weeks. When she finished, the nurse refilled it without being asked. The doctor returned and checked Yuki again. Already her breathing seemed a little easier, her color slightly better. He smiled at Keiko. "She is strong. She will be well." Then he did something that made Keiko's chest tighten with emotion. He gently touched Yuki's tiny hand, his expression soft with the same tenderness any father might show. After the initial examinations, the medics began distributing supplies to the mothers. They handed out bottles of formula for infants, jars of baby food, clean diapers made of soft cloth, blankets, and small care packages containing soap, towels, and basic medicines. Each mother received enough supplies for several days. When the nurse placed a bottle of formula in Keiko's hands, she stared at it as if it were made of gold. For weeks her own milk had been drying up, and Yuki had been slowly starving. The formula was American, the label in English, but the nurse showed her how to prepare it, demonstrating with warm water and careful measurements. This will help her grow strong again. Keiko mixed the formula with trembling hands and held the bottle to Yuki's lips. The baby latched on weakly at first, then stronger, drinking with desperate hunger. Keiko watched her daughter feed, tears streaming down her face, falling onto the clean blanket the Americans had given them. She couldn't stop crying. The relief, the confusion, the overwhelming gratitude and shame all mixed together until she was sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking. Around her, other mothers were breaking down too. A woman named Hana, whose 2-year-old son had just received treatment for a severe ear infection, collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed to her face as she wept. Another mother, Sakura, held her treated baby and rocked back and forth, making a sound halfway between laughing and crying, as if her mind couldn't process what was happening. The Americans seemed unprepared for this emotional response. Some nurses looked uncomfortable, unsure what to do. Others simply stood nearby, quietly offering tissues or gentle touches on shoulders. One young medic, barely 20 years old, sat down next to a crying mother and just stayed there, not speaking, just present. The nurse who had helped Keiko knelt beside her. "It's okay. Your baby will be fine. You are safe now." But Keiko shook her head, unable to explain that it wasn't just relief making her cry. It was the shattering of everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about the enemy. They were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they were saving her child's life. As evening fell, the women and children were transported to a temporary internment camp set up outside Manila. The camp consisted of rows of large tents, far cleaner and more organized than anything they had experienced during the final chaotic months of the war. Each tent had cots with thin mattresses, blankets, and mosquito netting. There were latrines, washing facilities, and a mess tent. Keiko was assigned to a tent with 5 other mothers and their children. They helped each other settle in, spreading out their meager belongings, setting up sleeping areas for the little ones. Yuki was asleep, the IV removed, but the antibiotics working through her system. Her fever had already started to come down, and her breathing was easier. That first night, lying on a real cot with a blanket, Keiko couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts that didn't fit together. The propaganda had been so clear. Americans were cruel, inhuman, capable of any atrocity. But today, American hands had saved her daughter's life. American medicine was coursing through Yuki's veins, fighting the infection that would have killed her. American food sat in her stomach, the first full meal she had eaten in weeks. In the darkness of the tent, she heard the soft breathing of other mothers and children. Someone was crying quietly, someone else was praying. Keiko reached out and gently touched Yuki's forehead. It was cooler, the fever breaking. In Japan, her daughter would have died. Here, in the enemy's camp, she would live. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and a routine emerged. Each morning began with a bell at 7 o'clock. The women would wake, tend to their children, and line up at the washing facilities. There was soap, actual soap, not the harsh lye bars they had used in Japan, but gentle soap that didn't burn their skin. Hot water came from large tanks heated by the sun. For mothers who had been bathing their babies in cold water or dirty streams, this was a luxury beyond imagination. After washing, they would go to the mess tent for breakfast. The meals were simple but abundant. Rice porridge with vegetables, bread with butter, eggs, fruit, and milk for the children. The first time Keiko saw fresh oranges on the breakfast table, she stood frozen, staring. Oranges. Real oranges. In Japan, such fruit had become impossible to find. Here, the Americans offered them freely to their prisoners. The children began to recover. Yuki's pneumonia cleared up within a week. Her cheeks filled out, her eyes grew brighter, and she started to smile again, reaching for her mother's face with tiny hands that were growing stronger every day. Other children showed similar improvements. The boy with the ear infection could hear clearly again. The toddlers with malnutrition started gaining weight, their bellies no longer swollen, their arms and legs filling out properly. Medical checkups happened twice a week. The same doctors and nurses examined the children, tracking their progress, adjusting treatments as needed. They distributed vitamins, treated minor illnesses before they became serious, and taught the mothers basic health care. One nurse spent hours showing them how to properly wash and care for their baby's skin to prevent rashes and infections. The mothers were also given light work assignments. Some helped in the camp kitchen, learning to prepare American-style meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing linens and clothing. A few with nursing experience assisted in the medical tent. They were paid small wages in camp scrip, which they could use to buy additional supplies from the camp store, extra soap, toothbrushes, combs, needles and thread, writing paper. Keiko worked in the kitchen 3 mornings a week. She learned to bake bread, something she had never done before. The American cooks taught her patiently, showing her how to knead the dough, when to let it rise, how long to bake it. The smell of fresh bread became one of her favorite things, a scent that meant warmth and safety and life continuing. But with the comfort came guilt. The The Red Cross eventually established a mail system, and letters from Japan began to arrive. Keiko received her first letter from her mother 2 months after arriving at the camp. She sat on her cot, hands shaking as she opened the thin envelope, recognizing her mother's handwriting on the outside. The letter was short, written on paper so thin she could see through it. Her mother's words were careful, measured by sensors, but the reality bled through every sentence. Your father is ill. We have no medicine. The house was damaged in the bombing. We live in one room now. Rice rations are smaller each month. Your brother's wife lost her baby. She was too hungry to carry it to term. We pray for you every day. Please come home. Keiko read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it away. She looked at Yuki, who was playing on the cot with a small cloth doll an American nurse had given her. Her daughter was healthy, well-fed, clean, happy. In Japan, her family was starving. Her mother was caring for a sick husband without medicine. Her sister-in-law had lost a baby to hunger. That night, Keiko barely touched her dinner. The rice sat heavy in her mouth, each grain a reminder of what her family didn't have. Around her, other mothers who had received letters showed similar signs of distress. One woman stopped eating entirely for 2 days until a nurse had to sit with her and persuade her that starving herself wouldn't help her family back home. The weight of their good fortune became a burden. How could they eat when their families were hungry? How could they sleep comfortably when their parents and siblings were living in ruins? How could they accept the enemy's generosity when their own nation had abandoned them? Despite the guilt, small moments of humanity broke through the tension. The guards at the camp were mostly young soldiers waiting to be sent home. Many had sisters or sweethearts back in America, and they treated the Japanese women with a kind of awkward respect, as if unsure how to interact with female prisoners. One guard, a tall young man from Texas named Private Miller, had a habit of bringing chocolate bars to share with the children. He would stand at the fence during his breaks, and the braver children would approach. He would break the chocolate into pieces and hand them through, his face breaking into a huge smile when the kids' eyes lit up. Keiko watched him one day with Yuki in her arms. Her daughter saw the other children getting chocolate and reached toward Private Miller, making grabbing motions with her hands. He laughed and approached, pulling out a chocolate bar. He broke off a small piece and offered it to Keiko. For the baby? His Japanese was terrible, but his meaning was clear. Keiko hesitated, then nodded. Private Miller handed her the chocolate, and she broke it into tiny pieces, letting Yuki taste the sweetness for the first time. The baby's eyes went wide, and she reached for more, making Private Miller laugh again. He pulled a photo from his pocket and showed it to Keiko, his little sister back in Texas, about 3 years old, with blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. She reminds me of my Annie, he said, pointing to Yuki. Kids are kids everywhere, I guess. Another moment came during a rainstorm. The camp's drainage wasn't perfect, and water flooded one of the mother's tents, soaking everything. The women inside scrambled to save their belongings and calm their frightened children. American soldiers appeared within minutes, helping them move to a dry tent, carrying children through the rain, protecting them with their own jackets and ponchos. They worked until everything was secure, then disappeared back to their posts without expecting thanks. The nurse who had first treated Yuki, whose name Keiko learned was Lieutenant Sarah Collins, became a familiar face. She checked on Yuki regularly, always with a warm smile and a gentle touch. She taught Keiko English words: bottle, diaper, fever, better. Keiko taught her Japanese in return. Baby mother, thank you, please. They communicated in this broken mixture of languages, but somehow understanding grew between them. One afternoon, Lieutenant Collins brought a camera and asked if she could take a photo of Yuki. She explained that she wanted to show her family back home that the children here were doing well, that the American Medical Corps was making a difference. Keiko agreed, and Collins snapped a photo of Yuki sitting up, smiling, healthy, and happy. Then Collins did something unexpected. She took a photo of Keiko holding Yuki and promised to send her a copy. 2 weeks later, Collins kept her promise. She presented Keiko with the photograph, carefully mounted on cardboard. In the image, Keiko saw herself and her daughter, both looking healthy and clean, Keiko's expression soft with love as she gazed at Yuki. It was a moment of pure maternal tenderness, captured by an enemy who had become, somehow, something closer to a friend. As the weeks turned into months, the women found themselves in a state of profound internal conflict. Everything they had been taught about Americans, about the war, about their nation's righteousness began to crack and crumble. At night, in their tents, they talked in whispers about these impossible contradictions. We were told they were demons, said Hana one night, her voice barely audible. We were told they would torture us, rape us, kill our children. But they saved my son's life. How do I understand this? Another woman, Michiko, responded with bitterness. Perhaps the demons were the ones who lied to us. Perhaps the demons were the ones who sent us to occupy foreign lands, who started wars we could not win, who left our families to starve while telling us we were superior to everyone else. Such words would have been treason in Japan. But here, in this strange space between captivity and care, the women began to voice thoughts they had never dared speak aloud. They questioned things they had accepted without question their entire lives. Keiko struggled with her own thoughts. She had been a loyal Japanese citizen. She had supported her husband when he joined the military. She had believed in her nation's cause, or at least she had tried to believe. But now, holding her healthy daughter, eating food provided by the enemy, sleeping safely under an American flag, she couldn't maintain those beliefs anymore. If the Americans value our children's lives, if they feed us and care for us when we are prisoners, what does that say about our own leaders who let us starve? If this is how they treat their enemies, how did we become the ones committing atrocities across Asia? These questions had no easy answers, and they kept the women awake at night, staring at tent ceilings, listening to their children breathe peacefully beside them. Not everyone reached the same conclusions. Some women clung desperately to their old beliefs. They insisted that the American kindness was a trick, a manipulation, part of some larger strategy to weaken Japanese resolve. They remained distant from the guards and medical staff, accepting help only because their children needed it, but refusing to acknowledge any genuine goodness in their captors. A woman named Ayako was particularly resistant. She had been a teacher in the occupied territories, teaching Japanese superiority to Filipino children. She maintained her rigid posture, her cold expressions, her refusal to learn English or interact with Americans beyond what was absolutely necessary. When other women talked about the kindness they had received, she would say, "They do this to make us weak, to make us forget who we are. Do not be fooled." But even Ayako's resolve began to crack. Her 3-year-old son had arrived at the camp with severe malnutrition and parasites. The American doctors had spent weeks nursing him back to health, patiently treating his various ailments, sitting with him when he cried in the night, teaching Ayako how to make sure he ate properly. One day, Ayako's son ran to Private Miller at the fence, calling out, "Meira! Meira!" His attempt at the soldier's name, reaching up to be held, and Private Miller picked him up, swung him around, making the boy laugh with pure joy. Ayako watched the scene, and something in her face shifted. She saw an enemy soldier treating her son with the same affection he would show his own sister. She saw her son, who had been taught to fear Americans, laughing in an American's arms. That night, Ayako sat with the other women, and for the first time she spoke honestly. "I do not know what to think anymore. I was so certain. I was so sure we were right and they were wrong. But my son is alive because of them. My son is laughing because of them. How do I hold on to hate when faced with that?" The women had no answers for her because they were all wrestling with the same impossible question. One day, the camp administrators organized a small event. They set up a projector and screen and invited the women to watch an American film. It was a cartoon, a Walt Disney production about a deer named Bambi. The film was in English, which most of the women didn't understand, but the story was clear through the images and music. The children sat on the ground, mesmerized by the moving pictures. Many had never seen a film before. They gasped when Bambi learned to walk, laughed when the rabbit thumper made jokes, and fell silent when Bambi's mother died. Several children cried at that scene, and so did several mothers. Keiko watched the film with Yuki on her lap, but she wasn't really seeing the cartoon. She was seeing something else, a nation that made films about forest animals, that created art celebrating beauty and innocence, that taught its children to care about nature and family. This was the enemy? These people who made such things? After the film, Lieutenant Collins approached Keiko. She was carrying something wrapped in clean cloth. She sat down next to Keiko and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small wooden toy, a simple pull-along duck with wheels. It had been carved and painted by hand, the work clearly done with care. "One of the soldiers made this," Collins explained. "He has a daughter about Yuki's age back home. He thought Yuki might like it." Keiko took the toy with trembling hands. She looked at it, seeing the careful craftsmanship, imagining an American soldier sitting somewhere whittling wood, thinking about his own daughter while making something for an enemy child. The duck was painted bright yellow with orange feet and a smiling bill. When Keiko pulled the string, the wheels turned and the duck's head bobbed up and down. Yuki reached for it immediately, delighted by the movement and color. She pulled the duck across the ground, laughing as it bobbed along. Keiko watched her daughter play, and the last of her resistance crumbled. She looked up at Lieutenant Collins, tears streaming down her face. "Why?" she asked in halting English. "Why so kind?" "We are enemy." Collins was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because your baby is not our enemy. Because you are a mother, just like mothers everywhere. Because kindness is not weakness. It is the hardest and strongest thing we can choose." She paused, then added, "The war is over. Now we have to figure out how to be human again. All of us." That night, Keiko wrote a letter to her mother. She tried to explain what she had experienced, the kindness of enemies, the health of her daughter, the impossible contradictions. But how could she make her mother understand? How could words capture the weight of having everything you believed proven wrong? In the end, she simply wrote, "Yuki is well. The Americans are not what we were told. I do not know what this means, but I know it changes everything." The transformation reached its peak 4 months into their internment. Word came that the women would soon be repatriated to Japan. Ships were being arranged. Within weeks, they would be going home. The announcement should have brought joy. Home. Family. Return to their own country, their own culture, their own people. But instead, many women felt a deep dread settle in their stomachs. What awaited them in Japan? Their country was destroyed, their cities in ruins, their people starving. They would be returning to a nation that had lost everything, taking their healthy children from this place of plenty to a place of devastation. More than that, they would be returning as changed women. How could they go back to their old lives after this? How could they look their families in the eye and not speak about what they had learned? But speaking the truth would be dangerous. Japan was still under military control, still holding on to the same ideology that had led to their defeat. To openly praise Americans, to admit that the enemy had shown them mercy, might be seen as betrayal. The night before they were scheduled to leave, the women gathered in one of the larger tents. They sat in a circle, children sleeping in their arms or on mats nearby. No one had called this meeting. It simply happened, drawn by a shared need to speak what they were feeling before it was too late. Hana spoke first. I am afraid to go back. I am afraid my family will not recognize who I have become. I am afraid they will see my healthy child and resent me for the food he has eaten while they starved. Michiko nodded. I am afraid too. But I am more afraid of forgetting. I am afraid we will return to Japan and slowly convince ourselves that this did not happen, that the Americans were not kind, that we did not learn anything that matters. Even Ayako, who had resisted for so long, spoke up. We cannot forget. We must not forget. Our children will ask us one day about the war, about the enemy. What will we tell them? Will we repeat the lies we were taught, or will we tell them the truth that the enemy showed us more humanity than our own nation did? Keiko listened to all of them, and then she stood, cradling Yuki against her chest. She spoke slowly, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. 4 months ago, I believed my daughter would die. I believed the Americans would let her die, or perhaps even kill her themselves. Instead, they saved her. They gave her medicine, food, care. They treated her as if she mattered, as if her life had value even though she was the enemy's child. She looked around at the faces watching her, all of them reflecting the same struggle, the same pain of recognition. I cannot unlearn what I have seen here. I cannot unknow what I now know, and neither can any of you. Tomorrow we will go back to Japan, and it will be hard. It will be harder than captivity was, because we will be free but carrying the weight of this knowledge. We will see our family suffering, and we will remember being fed by the enemy. We will hear the old propaganda, and we will know it is lies. She paused, then continued, her voice growing stronger. But perhaps that is what we are meant to carry. Perhaps we are meant to be witnesses. We saw the enemy's true face, and it was not the face we were told to expect. That matters. That changes everything, even if we cannot speak it aloud right away. One day, when Japan is ready to hear the truth, we will be here to tell it. Our children will know. Our grandchildren will know. And maybe if we hold on to this truth, it will help prevent another war. The tent was silent after she finished speaking. Then, one by one, the other women nodded. They understood. They had all been transformed by captivity, not broken by it. They were returning to Japan as different people, carrying a truth that their nation needed to learn, even if it would take years, maybe generations, for that truth to be fully acknowledged. The next morning, as they prepared to leave the camp, Lieutenant Collins came to say goodbye to Keiko. She brought one final gift, a small leather journal with blank pages and a pen. Write it down, Collins said, everything that happened here. Write it for yourself, for Yuki, for whoever comes after. Don't let anyone make you forget. Keiko took the journal with trembling hands. She hugged Collins, something that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. The two women held each other for a long moment, enemy and former enemy, mother and caregiver, human and human. Thank you, Keiko whispered, for my daughter. For everything. Collins pulled back, tears in her own eyes. Take care of her. Take care of yourself. Remember that you are strong and that kindness is not weakness. The ship that carried them back to Japan was crowded and uncomfortable, but nothing compared to the transport that had brought them to Manila. They had food, clean water, medical care. Their children were healthy, their bodies no longer wasted by hunger and disease. But as the Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon, the women fell silent, gripped by anxiety about what they would find. The reality exceeded their worst fears. The harbor city where they docked had been bombed into near oblivion. Entire neighborhoods were simply gone, replaced by fields of rubble. The few standing buildings were damaged shells. People in the streets looked like ghosts, thin and gray, moving slowly through the ruins. Keiko held Yuki close as she walked down the gangway. Her healthy, smiling baby seemed almost obscene in this landscape of devastation. Other women clutched their children with similar expressions of guilt and grief. They had survived, their children had thrived, and their nation had paid the price. It took Keiko 3 days to reach her family's home, or what was left of it. The journey involved trains that barely ran, roads that were half destroyed, and long stretches of walking. She carried Yuki the entire way, along with the small bag containing her few possessions, including the journal Lieutenant Collins had given her. When she finally reached the street where her family had lived, she almost didn't recognize it. The house was partially collapsed, the roof caved in on one side. Her family was living in what remained of the ground floor, 3 people crammed into a space that had once been their living room. Her mother answered the door, and for a moment neither woman spoke. They just stared at each other across a gulf of experience and suffering. Then her mother's eyes fell to Yuki, and Keiko saw the shock register. The baby was fat, healthy, clean. She wore clothes that were whole and unstained. She smiled and reached toward her grandmother with chubby hands. "You were in an American camp," her mother said slowly. It was not a question. "Yes," Keiko replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. "They fed you." Her mother's tone was flat, impossible to read. "Yes, they fed us. They gave us medicine. They saved Yuki's life. She had pneumonia, and they cured her." Her mother was silent for a long time, staring at her granddaughter. Then she stepped aside. "Come in. Your father will want to see you. He is not well." Inside, the reality of Japan's situation became even clearer. Her father lay on a thin mat, his body wasted by illness and hunger. Her brother's wife, the one who had lost her baby, sat in a corner, her eyes empty. They had a small pot of rice cooking over a makeshift stove, maybe enough for one small bowl each. Keiko wanted to explain everything, to tell them about the contradictions, the kindness, the transformation. But looking at their faces, their suffering, their loss, the words died in her throat. How could she speak of American generosity when her own family had been starving? How could she praise the enemy when that enemy had bombed their home? So she said nothing. She simply shared what little food she had brought, held her father's hand, and tried to help in any way she could. But that night, after everyone else had fallen asleep, she opened the journal and began to write. 20 years passed. Japan rebuilt itself from the ruins, transforming into an economic power. The war became history, something taught in schools but distant from daily life. Keiko married, had 2 more children, lived a quiet life. But she never forgot. She kept the journal, hidden in a drawer, and occasionally she would take it out and read her own words from those months in the American camp. She kept the photograph Lieutenant Collins had given her, showing herself and Yuki healthy and safe. She kept the small wooden duck, though Yuki had long outgrown playing with it. When Yuki turned 20, she found the journal while helping her mother clean. She read it over several days, and then she came to Keiko with tears in her eyes and questions. "Is this true? Did this really happen? The Americans really treated you like this?" Keiko nodded. "Every word is true. They saved your life, Yuki. When you were dying, they cared for you as if you were their own child. But we were taught that the Americans were cruel." Yuki's voice was confused, her worldview shifting. Keiko looked at her daughter, this young woman who existed because of an enemy's mercy. "We were taught many things that were not true. That is the nature of propaganda, Yuki. It takes the truth and twists it until we cannot recognize it anymore. I do not tell you this to make you hate Japan or love America. I tell you this so you understand that people are complex, that enemies can show compassion, and that the truth is always more complicated than what we are told." She paused, then added, "I tell you this so you will question. Always. So you will look beyond what you are told and seek the truth for yourself. That is the real lesson of the war. Not who was right or wrong, but that we must always think for ourselves. Always question, always look for the humanity in others, even when we are told they have none." Yuki held the journal carefully as if it were made of glass. "Will you let me share this? Let others read it?" Keiko thought for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes. It is time. The world needs to know that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, there can be moments of light. There must be. Otherwise, what hope do we have?" And so the story of those Japanese mothers and their sick babies became more than just a footnote in history. It became a testimony to something fundamental about humanity. That compassion can exist even in the midst of war. That enemies can recognize each other's humanity, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not violence but mercy. The medicine the American medics gave those dying children was important. The food they provided those starving mothers mattered. But what truly transformed those women was the recognition that they were seen as human beings worthy of care, that their children's lives had value even to their enemies. For Keiko and the other mothers, that September day in Manila Bay became a dividing line in their lives. There was before when they believed what they had been told about the enemy, and there was after when they knew the truth was far more complex and far more hopeful than any propaganda could convey. The wooden duck Private Miller's friend had carved, the photograph Lieutenant Collins had taken, the journal with its careful record of transformation. These objects became relics of a moment when the impossible happened, when enemies became caregivers, when hate was replaced by something infinitely more powerful. As Keiko told her grandchildren many years later, sitting in her small apartment in a rebuilt Tokyo, the Americans did not break us with cruelty. They broke us with kindness. And kindness, my children, is the hardest thing to carry. It demands that you see the humanity in your enemy. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. The war taught us to hate. But those months in the American camp taught us that even in war, there is room for compassion. And that lesson, difficult as it was to learn, was perhaps the most important lesson of all. The story of Japanese women POWs is a reminder that history is full of unexpected moments of grace. Times when people chose mercy over vengeance, healing over harm. These moments don't erase the horrors of war, but they prove that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine through. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more untold stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories matter. They remind us that even enemies can choose compassion, and that choice makes all the difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth is always more complex and more hopeful than we are told.